Hi, and welcome to today's podcast that will cover how to drive effective change in organizations. APQC is the world's foremost authority in benchmarking best practices, process and performance improvement, and knowledge management. With more than 1,000 member organizations worldwide, APQC provides the information, data, and insights organizations need to support decision-making and develop internal skills. I'm Maddie Lundquist, our Principal Research Lead for Process and Performance Management at APQC. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to APQC podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm excited to be joined today by APQC's very own Lynda Braksiek, our Knowledge Management Principal Research Lead, as well as one of our resident change management subject matter experts. Welcome.
Hi, I'm happy to be here, Maddie. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So for everyone listening, you're a little bit newer to APQC. So give us a quick, maybe 1 to 2 minutes, high level view of your past roles and how you've been connected into the change management space.
Okay, sure. So I got engaged with change management probably with one of my earliest roles in knowledge management and process improvement, ironically, both together. So a lot of lean principles are based around the focus on people first, right? As you're developing new processes and helping people move from a current to a future state. So I got introduced to the concept of change and people change management early on. And working in knowledge management and learning and development and leading teams over the last 20 plus years, the idea of thinking about people first and bringing change management into, I'll say knowledge management, but also anything that you do. So any project, any program, any team that you're leading, change management principles became the foundation and the heart of everything that I did, personally and professionally, I will say, both.
Nice. We were just on our process frameworks roundtable yesterday and talking about implementing a framework, and the biggest challenge is change. People don't want to change.
Absolutely.
So it's everywhere. Change is everywhere. All right, so let's jump in. The first topic today we want to discuss is forming a change management team. So what are some change management capabilities you would consider critical to an organization's success?
That's a big question because when I think about capabilities, I think about it in a couple of different ways. I think about it in terms of roles associated with change, think about it in terms of skill sets. And then there's always the question of, is it someone's full-time job or is it part of the role that we do currently? And I think the answer is that it can be any of those things, right? So I have seen change management principles embedded in a lot of different roles, process improvement, knowledge management roles, project management roles, leadership, all of those things. But if you have an actual change management team, it's a discipline. Change management is a discipline in and of itself. You can become certified in it. There's a lot of training that exists. And in some organizations, there are CMOs, or what they call change management offices, kind of like a project management office. And I saw teams, I would say, originally start mostly in the IT world. A lot of CMOs or change management offices started because they were supporting technology implementations. And that's where a lot of it began, and they started to build some of their capabilities. There's positives and negatives with that approach, obviously, but it has morphed over time to become something that's part of project management offices sometimes. There are roles that are embedded in business functions where they'll say, we need a change manager for this division, this function, this team. And then there's centralized versions of it where maybe you have a centralized program management office. People can have a centralized change management office as well that are focused on some of your highest priority initiatives. So the capabilities are, it is a discipline, and I think we need to recognize that it is a discipline in and of itself. And then the skill sets that are associated with that are also really important, just with the fields we work in, knowledge and process. There are certain attributes of a process engineer or certain attributes of a knowledge management leader or knowledge manager that we look for. Same is true for change. Right. And we could go into all the skills associated with change managers as well if you want to, but just thinking about those potential skill sets that go along with the change manager, it's not always the same as a process or a project or an engineer or whatever role you're talking about. So it's a very, I like to think about the fact that if you don't think about change as a role in and of itself and you make it everyone's job, it becomes no one's job. So you really have to be intentional about thinking about it, whether it's a team or a function within a team. It's still got to be an intentional focus on a specific change management role. So did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. So we'll get into a little bit about communication methods and training employees on change and a little bit further down in the podcast. But what do you think maybe is one of the most important things to consider between communication, empathy, coaching, or any of those like top of mind all the time when thinking about change?
Yes, absolutely. When I think about change, I think about listening and empathy and having the ability to coach. Those are all exceptional skills that go along with change managers. And when people have those abilities naturally, you can see them, you spot them, and you say, hey, do you know about change management? Do you think it's something you'd be interested in? And when you have that natural ability, a lot of those other skill sets can be trained, but to have the natural empathy and the ability to listen first and ask questions and be inquisitive enough to help understand why people might not understand a change or what have you is important. The communication component is, I think when people think about change, they think about communications and training. Those are the first two things that come to mind. They are extremely critical, but they are not all that change entails. We have to think about the resistance component. We have to think about the sponsorship and the leadership role in change. And we have to think about, again, that ability to coach, which is another word that if you dig into gets very deep, because coaching is not telling. Coaching is listening and asking questions and being inquisitive and understanding, and then showing empathy. When someone's resisting change, get to the heart of why they're resisting. Usually it's because they don't have enough information or they haven't been trained, so they don't feel comfortable with the change. So we need to get them more training or education or help them understand the why behind it, the connection. So communication is super important, but listening, empathy, coaching, and I'll be honest with you, I will say leadership skills in a change manager are extremely important as well, because you're managing change with peers. You're managing it with people who look up to you as a leader, and you're also managing up the chain as well. And learning how to manage and coach up is probably one of the most difficult things to do as a change manager. So I'll stop there.
Great. All right, so let's move into another topic.
Sure.
Let's discuss managing change projects, and sometimes there can be too much change. So let's talk a little bit about how to prevent change fatigue.
Oh, yes. Change saturation or change fatigue is I'll say in the last few years, it's become a more common topic of conversation in businesses. Obviously the pandemic started to bring on some of that, because we said we have to change now, we have to change fast, because we have to be able to continue to operate in this new world. That's one example. The other example is that I feel like everyone's really focused on transformation. And transformation means a lot of change. And transformation can be a scary word to a employee, because it's like, does that mean my job is changing completely? Am I going to lose my job? Do I have to move? Do I have to do? It can be a multitude, but they think of it as a very big change. So the word transformation can be scary. The thing with change fatigue is that it's, I always use this analogy, is your eyes are bigger than your stomach, right? I can eat all that. I can do all that. I can run that distance. You can't always do that. You have to kind of ease your way into things. And it's very difficult for organizations to admit that they have too many objectives on their plate, or that people are just not complaining, that they really are maybe taking on too much and there's too many priorities. So one side of the coin is, are you putting too much out there and your employees don't have the capacity to move as quickly as you would like? The other side of the coin is it what I call almost faux fatigue? Do the employees use it as an excuse because they don't want to do something different? So you have to be able to truly look at, do you have the capacity to do what you've put in front of your employees, and be able to measure, the readiness of the organization, and see if it's truly fatigue, or is it the faux fatigue that I like to say? And you have to be able to work together between employee and leaders and make sure that you're looking at it from the right. Just because an employee says there's too much to do doesn't mean there's too much to do. But they also need to listen and say, okay, tell me more about that. Yeah. That's where you need to inquire and say, help me understand why this feels overwhelming, or why does it feel like we have too much to do, because we believe we can do this, right? Mm-hmm. So it, all fatigue is, and all saturation is we have this many things on our plate and our employees don't have the capacity to actually go through all of that. So understanding what your employees' capabilities and readiness level are is important, but also making sure that they're all equipped with the skill sets and the capabilities and the tools and the resources they need to do what you ask them to do as well. Then you can look at that and say, is it real fatigue, or is it faux? But then also as a business, you can say, what are we going to do about it?
I was about to say, how do you then prioritize? So you say, I only have 3 spots on my plate, but I've got 10 things to do. How do you help organizations figure out what should be on their plate?
That's right. So the thing with that is, the organization's business leaders have to determine the priorities. The change manager's job is to make them aware that there could be too many things going on, or maybe this isn't the right direction, or the employees can't take this change on right now for these reasons, or we're experiencing more resistance than we thought, so it's going to take longer. All of that information has to get back to the business leaders, because ultimately we look to them to make those decisions around priorities. And we want to give them as much information as possible to make those decisions. So we have to be honest with them. We have to give them the quantifiable and qualitative right data to be able to show them what employees are actually feeling, what's real, what's not real, so they can make a good business decision. And a good business leader will look at it, analyze the information, and then make a decision and relay that information back to the organization. And sometimes we're going to take one priority off the list, or we're going to make a consumption choice, and we're going to do these 3, but we're going to take one from the bottom and we're going to move it back up to the top because it's now become more important. So can you imagine the consumption choices that happened during the pandemic? All of a sudden, virtual meetings and meeting technology became a #1 priority. That was on no one's radar that year. And I hate to use that as always an example, but
it's true.
It's a great example, right? And anytime something like that happens, your priorities are going to shift. A company could find out that they're being acquired.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden you have all these business leaders that didn't know any of this was on their plate. What becomes their first priority? That merger, that acquisition, that spinoff, whatever that looks like. And everyone rallies around that. We readjust our priorities. And that's where the change manager really comes into play, because they're going to be working with the people and relaying back to everyone, what are people feeling? Where might the resistance be? What are the capabilities we need to continue to build? And obviously, what do we need to communicate, and to whom and when?
And I have 2 thoughts there. One, having those processes that are the foundation of the organization that are well established will help when the random change happens. But then 2, you almost have a change within the change when you're reprioritizing. So it's
absolutely
managing the change of the change. So knowing, or having a really well thought out change management plan at the organization can really help with that too.
Yep. And a framework, like how do you approach change within your organization? Then you can adjust on a dime when you need to. It's not fun, but
who likes change?
Right. It's like, change sometimes is fun and sometimes it's not, but if you have a common way of talking about it and approaching it, it certainly makes it a lot more consumable for your employees and for the leaders too, right? If they have a way of doing that. So
no, that makes sense. All right, so we've talked enough, I think, about change fatigue. Let's move on to some different change management methodologies. You mentioned earlier there's various trainings you can do, different ways you can approach change. So what methodologies do organizations use to manage change? And should they adopt a particular set, or do you think maybe merging a few together and find, how do you figure out what works best? for your organization?
That's a good question. So, and we actually do have some research at APQC that talks about like different methodologies, which is actually pretty fascinating. I thought it was fascinating to see because I have my own experiences, but also just seeing what other companies are doing is fantastic. So of course you have your, your ProSci ADKAR methodology. One that wasn't actually in our research is one that's called William Bridges, which I'm very familiar with. And it's the concept of managing transitions. So thinking of change as a transition instead of an event. And sometimes we get hung up on the event of the change, but what's really hard is what happens after the event.
The phase twos that never
and we're
happen.
going through the transition of, okay, now I have a new process, my new technology. Now what does this new normal feel like? And it's the transition process. So that was one that wasn't even part of our research. So something for us to do in the future potentially, but you've got your Kotter's 8 steps. You've got McKinsey's model of influence that's out there, and a multitude of others, right? You could name them all. The Kubler-Ross curve, which to me is kind of the foundation, which talks about the change curve, right? Of what people go through when they're dealing with change. So those are all phenomenal models, and every company will take their own approach, as they should, right? It should fit. I always say the model should fit the culture of the organization that's best for them. Sometimes it's just who's leading the change management capability and what their experience is, and they bring that into the company, and that's great. I have noticed though that in our research, and also from what I've experienced, is a lot of companies want to establish their own way of thinking about change. So they've been to all those a lot of people have been to all those trainings for those different organizations, and they take the best of those pieces and parts, and they say, how are we going to talk about and manage change at our organization? Honestly, I don't know if I can say that's the best or the worst way to approach it, but I will say it's the most common way from what I'm seeing lately, right?
According, our survey said that 38% were internally developed. So everybody has the best way to do it.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. It's your own best way. And I like that because I've been to several of those different change methodology trainings, and I get something out of each of them. I have my favorite pieces and parts from all of them. I love the concept of transitions, like I said, with William Bridges. I love that the influence model is there for McKinsey, because what is change? We're trying to influence a new way of doing things. I love the ADKAR model from ProSci, because it's super simple to remember. And when someone asks me about change, I can get on a whiteboard and I can draw out ADKAR, right? So there's a lot of advantages to all those different things. In my most recent company, we actually did create our own version of a change management methodology, and it was a lot of fun. And it was using words that made sense to our company and our industry. And then we built some tools and capabilities around it. And guess what? We pulled 2 tools and templates from all those different methodologies. And we used what we thought worked best and were simplest and easy for our change managers as well as our employees to be able to pull from, so they could get better at change. So that's amazing. One more thing I will say from a methodology perspective, those are specific change methodologies, but one of the biggest components of understanding how to manage change in an organization, I think also has to do with leadership. And sometimes I think the methodologies, they do focus on leadership, but they're not going to teach you great leadership capabilities necessarily within those. Some of them have more than others, and that's okay. But getting the change component embedded in your leadership development activities in your company, I think is a huge win for companies as well. It's not just about the change practitioners, it's not just about the people, but it's about the leaders in the organization understanding that they ultimately are driving the change that's happening. So knowing how to lead from a change perspective, as opposed to a hierarchical or a directive approach, very different and extremely beneficial to the organization if they can think about what they're doing, that it's impacting people on a daily basis, and they have the patience and the empathy, right, to be able to lead from that perspective with that kind of, I'll say, servant leadership mindset, right? We're here to help serve you. Yes, we're here to run a business, but we're here to serve you so that you can do your job the best you can possibly be and get the best business results possible. So,
or even experiencing the change with your team.
Absolutely. Yes. Walking a day with your employees, right? Instead of looking at it from afar. Yeah, that's a great, it's a great point.
APQC's change management, we don't call it a methodology per se, but we have our process. And you said simple is good a little bit earlier. And we have our 4-step, it's just plan, design, implement, and sustain.
Yep.
And I think that speaks to a little bit of the transition version of change, because that sustain part is so critical in a change management methodology.
Agreed.
So
yes. And I love, I like, there's a sustain step in most all methodologies, but it's still, are we going to talk about the fact that a lot of people don't actually do the sustain part? And the other thing I like to think about is that sustain is also a great way to think about it, but I also like to think about it as evolve. Because once a change is in place, we don't really just want to sustain it. We want to continue to improve it and evolve it over time to become even better than what we thought it could be the day that we implemented it, right? So I like to think about it as sustainment and evolvement as well. So maybe we can, maybe we think about adding some capability into our own change model as we go forward. But that's really what sustainment means, though. It doesn't mean sustain it as is. It means sustain it and continually improve it, right, along the way. So,
So for a change management methodology to work, the organization should be ready. They don't necessarily have to be ready, because sometimes the change is thrust upon you per se, like a pandemic. So how do you assess if the organization or the team is ready for a change?
There are, I think, a multitude of ways to assess whether an organization is ready for change. There are literally change assessments that exist out there in different methodologies. And I actually do, that is one assessment that I actually do find very helpful, because it's kind of any kind of, whether you use it from a specific methodology or you create your own, whatever that looks like, but walk through a series of questions and that you can answer for your organization. Things like, is this change something that is welcome? Or is this change something that's going to be difficult for people to take on because it's so different, or it wasn't their idea? How well has change been managed in the past in your organization, and how are employees going to feel about something like this? Again, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, could depend on the department, could depend on what the change is. So just understanding the what the change is, and that excuse me, that topic of change, and whether that's something that's going to be well received or not. You need to know that. You also need to know, again, if you've never managed change effectively in the past, you have to be able to assess why or why not, and what are we going to do differently this time. But knowing that current state, it's just like process improvement. You have to understand the current state before you can then identify the gaps associated with it. And the goodness of a readiness assessment is that if you think about it just in, I'll say a quantitative factor, and you give yourself a score, that score will help tell you how much time do you really need to spend focusing on very specific change management things, like your communication plan might need to be 5 times more robust than it was for the last change because of the nature of this change. Maybe you're going to experience a lot of resistance. So you're going to have to put some time into your project schedule or your initiative schedule to be able to allow conversation and coaching around the resistance areas that you're going to experience, right? Those are just some examples. Maybe it's an entirely new skill set that's required. You're going to need an extensive amount of time to be able to build and deliver and assess whether the training and the capabilities are actually going to be, how long that takes for an organization. So it always depends on it. So knowing what that is when you start is going to help you to develop a very effective plan. And then the hardest part about having a change readiness assessment that's really powerful is getting people to buy into that. Because the company might say, we need this in 90 days. And you might do an assessment and say, but we need 120 days, or we need 6 months, or we need a year to do this for these reasons. If you have a good way of assessing change, you have a better chance at making that case and getting that extra time or those capabilities put in place to then ensure that your change is going to be effective. So it's a short-term it might not be, it's a long-term gain is really what it is, right? They want the short-term gain, but you're going to help them understand that for the long term, it's best if we do this and maybe extend it a little bit. It's a difficult case to make, but once you can do it, and again, if you have the data to back it up, right? It's very powerful, but I don't think you can do a change project if you don't know what the readiness of the team or organization is being impacted, where they're at in their change journey, right? So,
and if you don't, doing the assessment at least gives you something tactical to take to leadership if you have to manage up or say something about how much longer it's going to take to get a change, or you want us to do these 5 changes and this number 3 is going to take us a lot longer. So is there another one we could take off maybe? So at least it gives you something to work from.
Helps you with priorities, like you said. Could be that's where a priority shift has to happen, because if the data is accurate and they say, oh, we had no idea it was going to take this long, so maybe this one goes on next year's objectives, you know. So, and sometimes even if you have a readiness assessment, you might still be asked to do that change anyway.
At least you know what you're getting into, right?
At least you know what you're getting into, and hopefully you can do enough to help make the change be successful. But we're all faced with the fact that we'll have shorter timelines or less resources to do
more with less and less time.
Exactly. But at least if you know, you can get in front of it quickly, and you can try to get some things put in place that will help you get through it that much more effectively.
And if you already have that change management toolkit per se, you know which tools to pick out of that toolkit based on your readiness assessment.
Absolutely.
I like that. So we've talked a lot about that. Now let's move into communication. We've hinted about it along the way, but let's specifically talk about communication methods for a little bit. So what should organizations consider when communicating change?
Okay, this is another big question. So communication is, again, a discipline in and of itself. And in most companies, an entire organization or division, right? So there's a lot of implications when it comes to communication. And as a change person, sometimes you are the communicator. So in small scale changes, a change manager actually will become the person writing the communications and developing the communications as well, right? So you have to wear those multiple hats. In very large scale changes, you likely are going to have to partner with a communications organization as a change person, which is great actually, because then they have an entire communication plan that they're building that really is just part of your change plan, if you think of it that way. The thing with communication though, there's 2 things that I'll say about communication. Meaningful sender is one of the most important things. Who the message comes from impacts the change more than anything. And I don't have the research off the top of my head, but I know in change research, it states that the majority of employees want to hear about change from their direct manager. It's a very common communication kind of statistic that people understand. You're always going to hear messages from your CEO or division heads or whatever level that is about big changes, and that's great. But the next step is, how do we then equip managers or people who are directly managing employees with enough information that they can then help continue to carry that message forward with a supportive mindset, understand it for themselves first, because you have to remember they're going through the change sometimes too. So they have to understand it, be able to build their own set of buy-in and get through their biases and reject what they might want to reject, right? They have to go through their change process as well. Then they have to be able to have the conversation with their teams and coach them as well. And when you have an entire team of people, they're all not going to think about the change the same way either. So you have to have that ability to coach. So listen, absolutely, and be empathetic. So when Maddie comes to me and says, I don't like this change, and here's what I'm kind of afraid of as it relates to this change, I can have that dialogue with you, and I can say, okay, so tell me more about that. What is it that you're, what is it that you're experiencing, or what is it that you're maybe fearful of, or what do you think you're going to lose from this change? What are you going to gain? But the next employee might come in and be like, I'm so excited about this. I want to be part of this change. Please let me be a part of this change. You have to be able to address all of those different emotions and all of those different things happening. So Middle management in large scale changes becomes one of your most important set of communicators, and they're usually the ones that get forgotten. So provide, as a change manager, providing talking points and guidance documents for leaders. How do I have a conversation with my employees about this merger and acquisition? Give them some guidance, give them some talking points, help them do that. It's so huge. I mean, I think when we think about communications, a lot of times we just think about the formal things, right? You could have lots of different formal things. You could have external public relations things that have to be thought about. You could have internal, high level. But if you're asking employees to do something different, the most important communication aspect is what they're going to hear from their direct managers. And potentially, if you have a team of maybe change champions that you've elicited within the business to help with the ongoing change, they too have to be equipped to have a conversation with anyone who might call them
and
up.
say the same thing.
Absolutely, yes.
Not word for word, right?
Consistent message.
Yeah.
Consistent message, but also understanding the audience that they're dealing with, right? So different divisions within an organization, a finance person is going to be thinking about the change differently than an IT person, or a logistics or a procurement person, right? It just kind of depends on who you are. But so for communications, the audience analysis is huge. You must understand the audience that you're dealing with, the meaningful sender. And then I'll say one last thing about this. There's a chart that I absolutely love, and I've used it for years. And it's basically the chart is has to do with dealing with complex change, basically. And if any component of that complexity of change is missing, it creates frustration, confusion, false starts, all of those kinds of things. And the communication component can help you kind of keep all of those things in line and making sure that you're communicating the right things at the right time so that people are aware of what's happening. The other thing too is that I'm going to say the mismatch of messages. So we haven't talked about the change curve yet.
No.
But if you think about change in the aspect of I'm going through, I hear about it, I'm in a little bit of shock. I'm a little bit like, oh my gosh, what's this change about? I might drop into that little lull of, okay, I'm just going to not think about it for a while until it really impacts me. Maybe it'll go away if I stop thinking about it. But then when you start to come back up the other side of the change curve and realize, okay, this is happening. They're going to give me some training. I'm hearing some communications. I'm feeling a little bit better about this. Everyone goes through that change curve at a different pace. And that includes leaders. And leaders are the ones driving the change, so they know about it first. Middle managers maybe find out next, right? So they're the next in line, and they're going to go through their little change process as well. Then the rest of the employee base is going to find out. The leaders that are driving the change, they're excited about it. They came up with it. They think it's a great idea. They think everyone should be excited. That's how their messages are going to be portrayed. But if an employee is hearing about it for the first time, we need to make sure that we understand where people are at in their change journey so that the messages are appropriately phrased so as to not alienate people, turn them off, what have you. And I'm going to give you an example if that's okay.
I'm ready.
We had in a previous company that I worked at, we were getting ready to deal with a very major change. And the senior leader that I worked for, he was very excited about the change. It was a good thing. Ultimately, yes, it was a good thing. But he knew about it long before I did. He was part of the process. And I was his change person. I was his chief of staff. So I was responsible for helping him with developing the messages for his organization. I was in his office one day. I had literally just found out about the change the day before. Okay, just the day before. And I'm in his office the next morning and he's just all excited and talking about the possibilities. And he was just like, and I said, okay, I mean, no disrespect, but I'm going to need to stop you there because you're cheerleading about the change and I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to cheerlead this thing yet.
And not everybody would say that though.
Yeah. And that was the fortunate part of being the change person was I had the ability to say that to him and say, I'm not ready yet. I need to know more. I need to understand how this is going to impact me a little bit personally, then my team, the department, and then your whole organization. Then let's have a discussion about the really, what you want to say is really, really positive. And I said, I'm sure I'm going to get there, but I'm not there yet. And so therefore I can't craft a message like that, because if I can't accept it and I'm the change person,
Yeah.
I guarantee you the people in the organization are not ready to hear that from you.
Right.
And it was just a great dialogue, because I was sitting there and I was feeling so distraught by what he was saying, and I couldn't figure out why he just couldn't get on board. I just needed a little more time. I needed to understand it. I needed to understand the implications. And eventually we got there. But we started out with him saying more things like, I know you all have a lot of questions. Let me know what you're thinking about this. What are your initial thoughts when you hear that this change is happening in our organization? And once he was able to listen to people, he went, wow, I had no idea that people were going to be worried about this and this and this. He's like, I didn't even think about those things, you know? So it really helped us to break it down and make sure that we were communicating the right message. Now that change
At the right time.
Yeah, at the right time. And that change ended up being painful and long, but very effective in the end. Right. So it was a good process to go through, but I just will never forget that day. I sat there and I thought, I can't be a cheerleader for this yet. You have to stop talking right now, because it's actually upsetting me, you know? And I'm a big proponent of change. I like change. I move pretty quickly through change, but that one stuck with me. And I think that probably happens a lot. And a leader or someone who's responsible for a change, and especially if it was their idea, they're really excited about it. But not everybody's going to be as excited when they hear about it the first time. So you have to keep that audience in mind, and must communicate things at the right level, at the right time, and in the right way.
Yes.
You know, some things are an email, that's great. Some things are social, that's great. Some things they need a conversation. They want to hear from the leaders directly, face to face, you know, so.
Email and department level meetings are the top two that we found from our research. And that talks to your middle manager.
Absolutely.
Point. So we talked a lot about communicating the change that's going to happen. And we mentioned listening. So what happens when these middle managers are sitting in the meetings and they're listening and they're getting resistance and they have questions? How do those middle managers maybe communicate those resistances back to the person planning the change?
Good question. I think some of it is to go back to the change manager. You want it to be something that's at least, it's real, but it needs to be concise and put in ways that they can actually go take action on. It can't just be this person is complaining about this because they don't like this personally.
Right.
Okay. You're right. Let's look for patterns of things. Let's look for impacts to specific organizations that maybe we hadn't thought of. Like a specific change could impact, you know, IT differently than it impacts everybody else. Okay, that's good to know. We're experiencing all of this same kind of resistance from this type of an organization. It helps the change manager know that we might need to change our messaging or our training plan, or maybe we need to give them a little bit more time. So let's put them last on the training agenda, right? I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to shift around. The managers, like I said, they're going to give you they're going to give a change manager probably a lot of the raw data information. Oh my gosh, my team hates this. They're complaining about all of this. I think the job of the change manager is to say, okay, help me understand that more. Can you break down exactly what it is that they're not liking about this change? And usually you can get it broken down to one or two things, and then you can get to the root cause of why. It might have to do with it was done once before and done poorly. Maybe sometimes you have to think about the messenger. Sometimes the middle manager they're talking to may not be communicating it effectively. So you can actually go in and help. You can, as a change person, you can go in and help facilitate a conversation to understand where the resistance is coming from. As a third party associated with the change or the initiative, sometimes that opens up all the doors in the world, and it helps people to become more transparent, because it has to do with trust.
Right.
And if they don't trust middle managers are the best. I don't want to say middle, but managers who manage the employees themselves, the people being impacted by it. It could be a senior director, it could be a manager. It doesn't matter what the title. If they're managing employees, if they don't understand, or if they don't have that trust built with those people, it doesn't matter what they say. So getting to the heart of that can be extremely beneficial, because it can help actually point out areas, gap areas or problem areas within the organization. We might have to go deal with this on the side because we have an issue with this department or this manager that's even different from our change, but they're never going to accept it because of who the message is coming from. So there's going to be all these little nuances, right, that happen, and other, I'll say, problems can pop up in the process. And then you as a change manager you have to decide, how do I escalate this, or what do I do with this information, and it becomes you working with your sponsor in a change project, your sponsor and your project or program manager, like you guys really work together really closely to make sure that the change is happening effectively. You're just one component of the change, but you're the more, I'll say, the conscience of the change, right? Bringing forth how people are actually feeling about this.
So we were talking about the talking points that you could give the middle managers. Have you seen, or in your example, did you happen to give those managers or the messengers almost like a decision tree type flow, if your employee is resisting this way, then here's some ways you could address that?
Yeah, there's a lot of tools like that that can be created for managers. So there's talking points about a specific change. That's always really helpful, but that's where I would say that gets more into the actual leadership components of a leader's job, is to be able to deal with, if this person is having resistance because of personal issues, this is maybe how you deal with this. If they're having resistance because you and this person don't get along, that's a whole different problem, right? So there's components to deal with the change itself, and those are great, but the leadership capabilities of that person to be able to discern, is this really about the change? Or is this about this person and they're not happy in their role, or they don't like you, or they're having a bad day, or whatever? Those are basic, I'm going to say, not basic, but those are leadership capabilities that they need to be able to discern what's going on. And that's where those coaching capabilities and the asking questions and being empathetic to people with what's happening. Sometimes you can dig in and it's really not about this change. They're just mad at something else, right? Or they're struggling with something else, or they're feeling, they're not feeling very confident about what's happening, and adding one more change to their list just sent them over the edge. That's about their personal development. That's not about the change necessarily. So you need to back up the train sometimes, and you need to be a leader. And then you can come back to talking about the change that's at hand at the same time. So.
All great points. So one more question, and then we'll move on from the communication bucket of change. So any thoughts on the cadence or frequency, or how far in advance communication needs to happen?
That's a good one. And that answer does have to be, it depends. Because, sometimes there could be legal implications with communications. If you're doing something like a merger and an acquisition, obviously you cannot communicate some things ahead of time, or an organizational change or something like that. There are some things that unfortunately feel like they happen in the moment and they happen quickly. That's the nature of those things. But most changes that happen, we're getting a new technology, or we're rolling out a new process for something like that. Involving your people early and often is what I always say, early and often, because research says you have to hear something 5 to 7 times before it ever sticks. And I would say that's probably closer to 10 or 11 times, because until you need to know that information, you're not going to pay attention, right? So as early as possible. Also, I think you can begin the communication process. It doesn't have to even be in mass. Who are the people who are most impacted by the change? And how can they help us with designing the change, bringing them into the fold, so that by the time you get to the mass announcement, everybody almost already knows, right? Because you've done a pilot and you've brought in business people to help you with designing the change, and you've did focus groups to get feedback on how might this impact you and your organization. Leaders just talking to their leadership teams and getting feedback, right? There's lots of ways to do communication in small pockets that will eventually build you up to the time when you finally do that mass communication. It's really not going to be as big of a deal, but now it's finally out there. Everyone has seen it. We're working toward it. And then we just keep working together. So it's kind of using like agile principles, if you think about it, right? You're experimenting, you're piloting, you're refreshing, and then you just keep moving. With communications, as much as you can do that as possible, I think is the best. I feel it's not like you don't want groupthink, and you don't want everybody making the decision. Ultimately, we know who the decision maker is. but bringing as many people along for the ride so that you can get the change right the first time. If you don't include all the right people, chances are you're not going to get it right the first time. Then you're going to deal with all the resistance and all of that. So early and often, that's what I've learned in my career. And I think that's a great model whenever you can do that, as early as possible and as often as possible. If I hear it once, likely I won't remember it. It's in an inbox somewhere, or I missed it because I was on vacation, or, you know, something like that.
And various methods too.
Absolutely.
For example, maybe an email and a Teams message, and then a follow-up in a meeting.
Absolutely.
Repetition.
Absolutely.
And you talked about the change readiness assessments earlier, and that could also guide your communication frequency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. If it's something that, if it's a welcome change, right, it'll be a lot easier, and you might not have to communicate as often. But if it's one that's going to be resisted and it's global and it's widespread, you know, you're going to have ongoing, that's where people will establish some sort of a cadence or a channel, like a social channel, where it's like, for all things on this change, look here, we're going to be providing you updates on a regular basis. Please subscribe. You know, those are great ways of using those kinds of capabilities to keep people as engaged as possible, and making sure that your leaders, you know, it's being cadenced at quarterly business review meetings. It's being cadenced at monthly leadership meetings. It's being, you know, you can establish all of those true cadences. And the great thing about communication and plans and all of those things is that you have a ton of communication channels already in your organization. Leverage what you have. You don't have to create a bunch of new ones. Leverage what you have,
or where they already are.
Leadership meetings, social channels, regular business reviews. If there's a change management team or whatever, you're talking about it in your change team, right? If there's project management teams, you're talking about it in the project teams, right? You use those communities of practice. Communities of practice have proven to be one of the most powerful communication channels in organizations. And for companies that have very advanced knowledge management practices, and they do have structured communities of practice, when you're managing a change, when I've managed changes in the past, I go to the community networks and I say, we're doing that. Here's a change that's upcoming. Either can we send someone to a community of practice if you do like actual meetings and gatherings to talk about it with the community, or can we post it in your channel or what have you? Communities of practice are people who have a desire to continue to learn and share information, and they will be your best advocates for change. And they will ask questions and they will challenge, right? So use those community of practice channels if you have them in your organization. They will be some of your best, they will do the communication for you. I mean, it's a really change agent. They are built-in change agents. They are built-in community or communication channels. Amazing, amazing. So if you don't have communities of practice, we have lots of research as well at APQC around how to establish communities of practice, right, as part of your knowledge sharing principles, but they do serve as a really key component for communications and for change, and they help the change move through the organization much quicker.
We completed a case study through the change management research, and something really cool that the organization did is they had a logo for different change initiatives. That way, every piece of communication that went out about that specific project, there was a little icon. So you received an email about project A, you knew that it was project A right off the bat because of the icon. I thought that was, as a former marketing person, I found that like brand recognition. That's so cool.
That's a brilliant, actually, that's a really brilliant approach. And I have experienced that in my career as well, and in a lot of corporations, they will, you have to be careful, because if you have too much branding happening in your organization, it can start to become confusing to people. So usually working with your marketing department, your branding department, to establish what does that look and feel like within your organization. So maybe it's certain size of initiatives will get their own brand, or it's a standard way of branding something, but it still looks, it's like, it looks the same, but slightly different. So that it always looks like your company logo. It always looks like your company colors and all that kind of stuff. So love the concept of branding a specific change. Just make sure that you're checking with your organization and how they feel about that. And they might establish a really standard way for you to do it, where it's like, whenever it's green, it's an HR thing, or whenever it's purple, it's a finance thing, right? They'll help you with figuring that out. So people start to see that common, like you said, it's I see this email pop up and I see this brand, I know exactly what it's going to be about.
Yep.
oh, this is about our HR transformation journey, or, oh, this is about our process improvement journey, right? That's a great point. And it's I think one of the best uses of internal branding as well, is to really help people just kind of buy in and get excited about it. It actually speaks to rewards and recognition as well, because then you start to see things like, what do they call them at the bottom of your emails when you've earned a recognition, like
a certification?
Yeah, it's like a something, and it'll have, like, you can put it at the your email signature, that, you know, if you're working on a specific project, you can use that brand like in your email signature and things like that as well. And then people start to recognize that you're involved in that, so they can ask you questions and things like that. So great. I love that. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, but the branding concept is brilliant for change. If you can do it.
Yeah, if you can do it well.
Yeah.
And there's so many communications we receive now, and so many emails a day. And when it's branded, it's a little easier to say, hey, this email I need to pay attention to. Maybe I'll flag it or pin it and I can read it later, versus just another email from so-and-so about XYZ.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. And maybe even who it comes from. That's where it gets to that meaningful sender. If it's coming from the right sender, people will always make sure that they're reading it, whether it's in a social channel or whether it's in an email. They'll be like, oh, this is from my boss or this particular person. I'm going to make sure I read this. So the meaningful sender can actually tie into that too. So it's a great point.
We could talk about communication for
I
hours,
I know. Well, there's so many different approaches.
Yeah.
And there's so many new and unique ways that you see someone do that and you think, I want to do that now the next time I do a change. So it's really fun to just come up with different ways of doing it. The other thing too is that that's where pulling from your employees early, they can help you with identifying communication channels that are out there that you might not know about, or ways of thinking and marketing the change that would be most effective with the employees, because they are the ones doing the job, right? You're not necessarily. So they can really help you with developing the communication plan and becoming part of it. They can become your senders too. Those early adopters or those people that you bring in right away, they can become your senders, because let's face it, half the time the change manager, that's not who the message should come from. As the change manager, you're not leading the change, you're not driving the change, and you're not even, in a lot of cases, it might not even impact you, depending on what the change is. You might not be doing that process or using that technology. So you might be an influential person and respected and all of that, and that's great, but they need to hear from the people who are giving them their performance reviews and, you know, working with them every single day. So that's the one thing about change managers, is that it's not, I always say, it's not about you.
It's kind of like an orchestra, or I think of like the conductor. They're usually kind of hidden. And then at the very end of a performance or something, you see them stand up, and they're responsible for everything being harmonized together, but it takes each individual group to make it pretty.
And they usually do the thing with their arm where they actually give the credit to the orchestra behind them, because those are the people who actually made the music happen. They just helped bring it together. That's a great analogy. I like that. I'm going to use that now going forward. I like it. I like it.
All right, so let's move into talking about training employees. So when talking about training, are you talking about training the employees on conducting change, or training them on the change initiative itself?
That's a good question. And I think in every change project, it actually has both. Most change projects, I can't think of a change project that maybe didn't involve some sort of education or training of what the change is. New process, new technology, new way of doing something. There's going to be some little component, could be a large component, could be a little component of change or of training. And you have to have a training plan. Again, another discipline that has an entire process wrapped around designing and implementing a training plan, right? Small scale changes, the change manager could end up being responsible for some of that training, and they probably have the skill set to do it. Large scale changes, you're probably going to be eliciting the help of a learning and development organization or a training specialist, where you're going to have to translate to them what that change is, along with your business people and subject matter experts, and develop training and deliver it in different modules and in different ways. It all depends on the scale of the change. That's for the change itself. As far as training people on change, for a specific initiative, at the beginning of a change initiative, when you're kind of bringing the project team together or a program team together, I think it is important for the change manager to educate the project team on change management, and how you're going to be working together, because not all project teams have worked with an actual change manager, or even using all those components of change that we talk about, like managing resistance and developing training plans and communications and what that looks like. So there's a component of that that has to happen at the beginning to help educate the project team on what that looks like. And I was always a proponent of, we're starting from the beginning and we're making the assumption that no one knows anything about this, and we're going to have a little change management 101.
Yeah.
This is what I mean.
Or they may have done it somewhere else.
Correct.
And they don't know what the specific organization they're at now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. So this is what we mean when we say change management here. This is kind of how the process is going to work. This is how we're going to work together. This is the expectations I have of you. Now you give me your expectations, right? It's a great way to really, I'll say, educate the project team and get everybody on the same page. Just as a program or project manager would do at the beginning, they'd say, this is how we're going to operate the project. These are the roles we're all going to play. This is how we're going to work with business subject matter experts and all of that. I think there's actually a third component, and that is change management in general, not associated with a project, not associated with a specific initiative, but are you as a change person responsible for helping to educate the organization in general or as a whole on change management? And some have that responsibility in organizations, some don't. Some will take it on as a responsibility because they get asked to.
So voluntold.
Yeah, voluntold, like, you're going to help this organization with change management. And it's like, okay, you know,
Tell me more.
Yeah, tell me more. So, you know, having, again, if you have a methodology within your organization, how are you making sure people understand that? How do they leverage the tools? How much of the tools do you want them to leverage themselves?
What's in their toolkit?
Yeah, exactly.
What can they access?
Yeah, yeah. So there's toolkits for people because you want them to become better, change-minded individuals, period. But you also have some where it's like, let me know if you need some help, because some of this is going to be more complex change, and I'm going to want to help you, you know, manage through that. So there's times when using a change manager is kind of like, I need a consultant to help me out a little bit. And then there's times where I can do some of this on my own, right? A little bit like process improvement. Having a process improvement mindset helps you improve how you work and within your teams, but you might reach a point that you need to bring in a process engineer or a process expert to really help you revamp processes.
Exactly.
It's kind of the same concept for change.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about approaches. So, and who should receive the training. So you talked about the change managers or employees. Who's receiving the change or the training for change? Interesting.
So again, like if it's a project team, it's going to be the people who are in your core project team is usually how I've seen it done in the past.
And you're talking, let's specify here.
Sure, yeah.
So who should receive the training on how to conduct change?
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Uh-huh.
So there are, for change practitioners, people who are identified as an actual change expert or a practitioner within an organization, definitely need to receive the, how do we do change at this organization? How do I conduct these assessments? How do I create communication plans? How do I ensure a training plan is in place? Like the whole gamut of how do I operate as a change practitioner, almost a role-based approach to training, right? I think that's one way. Then there's change capabilities. I think change management capabilities built into leadership curriculum, which I think is actually one of the most important in an organization. If there isn't something about driving and understanding and leading change in your leadership curriculum, please add it.
Yeah, because not all change is this huge change. Like, I mean,
no,
somebody has to change desks. That's a change. It may be a huge change for some people. And so having that in the back of a leader's mind is critical.
Yep. And then I think there's that kind of middle level. So the leadership is really important. The change practitioners are really important. And there could be some key roles in your organization that the expectation is that you do know and understand change a little bit. A training person, a project manager. In a lot of cases, project managers don't have change managers available to them. So having some of that capability is super powerful to have.
Maybe like a product owner.
Yeah, like a product owner in an agile world, absolutely. A product owner, even a scrum master, right? They're getting people to kind of keep moving through a process on a regular basis, process engineers. anyone who's asking people to go from today to tomorrow and it looks a little bit different, right? And I think the average employee, in all honesty, a little bit of change is good. If they're working with external client or, members, customers, clients, whatever you call them, a little bit of that empathy and listening ability is super, super helpful. I think of a lot of HR roles. Yeah. Right? Change management is a big component of human resources organization. A lot of times they own a lot of that training. Sometimes they'll purchase like very basic change management training from companies that they can get training from. And that's great because it's just the basic principles of change and people and all of that. And I think that's fantastic. A lot of, I've seen more than one company. We talked about communities of practice earlier. I've seen more than one company in my career have a change management community of practice. And that's a great place because it can bring a multitude of people from novices all the way to leaders that are getting together to talk about change. And they can learn from one another. They can talk about complex, they can talk about simple. They can share their stories of change and how certain things were helpful or harmful as they were managing through change at all different levels of the organization. But it's a way of bringing it into people who just kind of care about it, the average employee. So there's so many different levels, but leadership, your change practitioners, and then knowing those key roles who really could benefit from understanding at least the most basic principles of change, enough to know that they can do some of it on their own, but enough to know when to ask for help from a professional
and where to ask for that help.
And where to ask for that help. Absolutely.
So the other side of the coin, I think, is a little more straightforward, but when a change is going to happen, who should receive the training on that specific change project? Everybody and anybody, right?
Yeah, well, whoever's impacted, again, this is with your audience analysis, right? This goes back to audience analysis. There could be different levels of training.
True.
Right. Some, and this happens a lot. So certain changes will require training for leaders, but that could be like an hour training because they just need to know the high level and they need to know how their employees are going to be impacted and what to expect. Right. That's the leaders. Then there could be the managers. How do you talk to the people about change and what is the change? They need to know enough to have empathy for the people who are being impacted by the change, the new technology, the new process, the new org structure, whatever that looks like. And then that's the actual detail, the details behind the change. Like I'm going to be using a new system as an employee, a new ERP system or a new module in your ERP system is being updated and rolled out. You could end up in a 40-hour a week long training and even user testing, and you could be doing lots of things. So it kind of depends. And in most cases, especially large scale changes, you're probably going to have 2+ versions of the training. Just don't forget those different audiences. Don't think that just an email is going to be sufficient for your leaders when what they really need is at the minimum a half hour or 45-minute overview, understanding so that everybody's hearing it the same way and hearing it at the same time so they can be prepared. So different levels depending on, but the person most impacted by the change obviously is going to have the most extensive training, and they need to have guides and modules and a place to go after the fact. And one of the best ways, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know this was going to keep coming up today. It just kind of keeps coming up, but to sustain a change, I had a lot of people come to me and say, do you think a community of practice would really help us sustain this? Because we have this new technology and we've trained them and the training was really good, but then they go day one and they don't have anybody to go talk to about it. And would a community be helpful? And I'm like, absolutely.
And I think another, you were thinking communities of practice from a KM perspective. My mind went to a power user.
Yeah, same concept. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very similar concept. Sometimes communities of practice are for super users. And that's how we would phrase a community. Like it's a network of people who need to know and talk to each other about what's happening and share best practices about, hey, did anybody try this piece of the module today? Because I had to go do this and this and this, and that wasn't in the training. So the other thing too is get that information back to the change and the project team so that if they need to update the training for future users, it's a closed loop system, right? You're identifying issues, you're putting them back into the process so that it can be corrected for the next time around. And
when it's a more cross-functional team of power users or community of practice, then you also get different ways the change
Correct.
is affecting everyone across the organization, because what matters in one department may be different than the other,
Absolutely.
or their daily job may be so drastically different that it's something you didn't even think about affecting this other group over here.
Yeah, it's a great point, because it's those kinds of things that come up in training that you didn't even anticipate. So how do you capture them, get them back to the right people, capture the nuances by department, by role, and make sure that that's communicated back to those people, but also that it's put back in the training for future users if you're going to be doing ongoing. That's where the sustainment piece comes in. Don't forget about the ongoing training that might need to happen after the initial change happens, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to engaging employees. We've kind of hinted at engaging employees throughout the whole podcast today, I feel like, but what are peer level change agents? Or I feel like we've said change agents a lot.
We haven't really defined them, have we?
Let's stop and define what is a change agent.
You know, that's a really good question, because I've seen so many different approaches. Change agent, change champion. We use some different terms for them. It doesn't matter, whatever works in your organization, whatever makes the most sense, but
or power user, you know, if you don't even want to put change, or you know,
like in an IT world, people would use the terms a lot of times, super user, power user, whatever. Again, it has to make sense to your organization and to your audience. So whatever that word is. What we mean by that, though, is those people that we know are, I'm going to say a change champion. I'm going to use that term just generically to mean all those things we just said. Who are the influencers? Who are people going to follow? Listen to, right? Who are the people who are going to help you manage the change effectively? Because let's face it, they're a team player. They're good at what they do. And like I said, people follow them, people listen to them. When you can bring those people together throughout a change project, even if it's, so this is just an example, it might help people understand. Large scale project, maybe it's a year-long project, you establish a group of change champions or agents within your organization, maybe from different parts of the company. You bring them together, introduce them to the change, ask them if they would be willing to help you. They're going to say, what does that entail? Because I don't have a lot of bandwidth, right? They're always going to say this because these are the important people in the organization. Again, they're the influencers. And basically all you need from them is to know what the change is, ask them to start communicating and talking to people in their organization about it, get back together with them maybe once a month, every other week, every 2 months, whatever the right cadence is, and get feedback from them. Tell me what your people are saying. When you talk to your team about this, what did they say? What are they concerned about? What are they excited about? What do they think we need to do different? What do they think, you know, and you give them some information each month as the project goes along to help them continue to communicate. It's kind of like the talking points we talked about with managers, same thing. Give them enough information to take back to their peers and their networks and the people they work with to share what's happening, get some feedback, bring that back to us, be transparent with us, tell us what that's all about. That's to me how you use those agents or those champions. And then they also are usually they could become pilot participants, and they become your super users, power users. They're just the voice of the change. And again, they are meaningful senders within their organization. If I know my go-to subject matter expert within my department is John, and John is now a part of this change network, when he comes back and he tells us things, we're going to listen, and we know we can tell him our feedback, and he's going to go make sure that that feedback gets incorporated. I sleep better at night. I know that my voice has been heard, and I can move on and do my job. And I don't have to waste time and energy complaining or worrying or wondering about the change, because I know John's got it. He's going to go back and take care of it for us. To me, that's a power user, that's a change champion, that's a change agent. And those are some of your most powerful advocates within the organization. It also gives the change manager some of that real data that they can take back to their leadership sponsors if there's an issue. And they can say, this is what we're hearing from the procurement department, or this is what we're hearing from HR. This is real. This is coming from our people. And here's what we want to do to go address that. And here's what I need you to do as a leader to help us address it, right? You know, so.
And I've seen in some organizations too, where the change champion, maybe they know someone's really going to resist the change. So they'll be like, hey, why don't you be a part of our change team to help get their buy-in to not show other people that they're resisting the change.
Yeah, that's a great point, because
It's like a mind trick.
it is. And it's a great point, because I said before, when I talked about change champions, I said, get those influencers. I don't always mean good influencers. That's a great thing to bring up. Sometimes the people who are going to be your greatest challengers, you want in that group, because you know they're going to be honest, they're going to push back,
They're ask all the questions.
Correct.
Yeah.
But those greatest challengers usually become your greatest advocates, because they're so passionate about what they do, which is why they dig deep and they ask questions and they do all that, and you need them. You really, really do need them. And even though sometimes it's hard, you need them. Like, again, they become your greatest advocates. And in some cases, these change champion people can actually become trainers. If you have formal training that needs to happen, usually you do want trainers that are subject matter experts, because they do it every day. You need them to be part of the training process. You can build them right into your training plan as well, if bandwidth allows, right? You know,
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So we've talked a lot about change today. But if you could pick two main ideas to provide organizations embarking on change, what would they be?
The one thing that I always like to tell people is, do not get hung up on the model. Right? Do not get hung up on the model, and don't be so model driven that it's like it's
puts you in a box.
Yeah, it puts you in a box. Change management is like anything, really. There's great methodologies for it, and there's great models for it, but it can never be followed from A to Z exactly the same any 2 times in a row. It's never the same. You have to be able to be agile. You have to be able to adjust. Now, you want a common language about how you talk about change. So if you're going to pick a model, that's great. Pick a model. Don't get hung up on it, though. Pick what works best for you, create whatever that is, or use whatever you think it is, and kind of stick to it and make it your own thing. Even if you're going to use an existing methodology in industry, that's fine. You're still going to make some adjustments as you go through. You don't follow it A to Z every time. You have to be able to assess the circumstances and apply what's relevant to your organization, to your culture, and to the specific change. So the flexibility, and don't get hung up on the models and stuff. Just pick your way, define it, and move forward and go do good things, right? That's one thing.
Yeah.
I would say the second thing, you said 2 things, right? The second thing I would say is leadership. It's the one component that sometimes is very difficult, but it's also one of the keys to change is great leadership, sponsorship, and buy-in. And as a change practitioner, it's one of the more challenging things to do, and that's to challenge a leader, to take them difficult information, to disagree potentially with them. Candid, I had a leader that, and if he happens to hear this podcast, he will laugh that this stuck with me after all these years. Candid conversation with respect. That was his mantra. Candid conversation with respect. We must have honest conversations, no matter what level of the organization we are, but we do it with respect, because we want the same things in the end, right? So change managers have to have a lot of courage, and they have to really focus on the leadership aspect. We get so hung up on, need a comm plan, we need a training plan, we have to manage resistance. All of those things matter in change. But if you do not have a great leadership sponsor that you can sit side by side with and manage the change, I can almost guarantee you that you will not be successful. And I think you will actually find a lot of that information in our research at APQC as well, that speaks to the power of the leadership sponsor in change. But you'll also find it in some of our human capital management research around learning and development, and the leadership development aspects, that changes are not going to be as powerful if you do not have that voice of the leader and they don't understand it. Unfortunately, in my career, I've met change managers before, and I'd say, who's your sponsor? And they'd say, well, it's the CEO. And I'm like, do you actually have conversations with this person? And they're like, well, no, I don't get to talk to them. They're not really your sponsor then. A true sponsor of change is a person that you get to be side by side with, provide coaching to them, and they provide coaching to you, and they become the voice of the change. So sometimes you might have too high of a level of sponsor and all that. So just focus on the leadership and really, really think about the leadership component of the change. As a practitioner, that person can become one of your most powerful sources for the change. To me, sometimes it's the difference between success and failure is, was it led appropriately? I might have done all my tactics right from a change management perspective, but if my leader was not along and saying all the right things and supporting the organization, it still might not be effective. So leadership, and don't get hung up on the model, right? To me, those are two really, really big things.
Yeah.
That's just Lynda's point of view. Everyone might have some different, so I'd love to hear more from other people, right? Like what they think about what are their greatest learnings when it comes to change, because I think this topic can just go on forever and ever.
And the world is ever changing,
I
right?
know,
So there will be change forever and ever. Going back to your having a sponsor on a change, that makes me think of strategic initiatives, for example, and you're having an executive sponsor per se, and they almost become your change agent for the leadership team.
Absolutely.
To communicate the change to them. And then you hear back from leadership so that then it's like this interwoven web of change agents throughout the organization. So.
And you know what, that's such a great point, because not all executive leaders, if they were sponsoring something, would they know that their responsibility is to go back and talk to the leadership team about it? So as a change practitioner, it's your responsibility to ensure they understand their role as a sponsor. And that's something that's really hard to do as a change person the first time, is to look at a senior leader and say, here's what I need you to do as a sponsor. Give them a roadmap, give them specific things that they can work on. And I'm going to say 99.9% of the time, they are extremely appreciative of it, because they have a roadmap. They know then what they need to do, and they know all the communication forums. Some of them are naturals at it, and they're just going to do it anyway. But some of them, they've got a million things going on at a time, and just you giving them those little reminders is amazing. You know, they appreciate it. One of the first change projects I ever worked on, I was scared to death to walk into the office of a vice president and say, hi, I'm Lynda, and I'm going to be the change management person on this particular initiative, and you're my sponsor, and I'd like to have a conversation with you about your role as a sponsor. And I thought this could be career limiting for me, right? Fortunately, I knew the person fairly well, so he was very open to the conversation, but we sat down and I talked through, here's what I'd like to see you do throughout the project. Here's kind of how we're thinking about it. And he said, you know what, Lynda, I've been a sponsor of a lot of projects in my career. And he said, I never really knew what that meant. He literally was honest enough to say, I never really knew what it meant other than to just show up when they told me to show up and say these things. And I said, well, that's a little bit of it, you know? But he said, I really appreciate you laying it out on a roadmap and saying exactly what you need me to do and where you want me to show up and things like that. You know, I mean, obviously he's a smart man. He knew the organization. He didn't need me to give him the talking points and stuff. I just needed him to be visible and be present and let people know that he really did care about it. But he's like, I love this. He goes, now in 6 months, I know what I need to do over the next 6 months for this. And he goes, and you're going to remind me, right? Yeah. I said, absolutely. I will help remind you. But they just, leaders are really busy and they're moving from place to place all the time. So don't make the assumption that they're not going to want to talk to a change practitioner or something like that. Take that opportunity to get to know them and help them, and they will become your greatest advocate, and they will become one of the greatest communication channels, right, for your particular, and they will, most importantly, they will help you break down those barriers when you run into problems. If you have that good relationship and you run into an issue, budget issue, serious resistance, the technology blew up, right, you know, you name it, they're the person you can go to and say, here's what we're experiencing. We need you to go break this barrier down because you can at your level and with your authority. It's hugely beneficial to the organization, to everybody, to the change, but to the organization as a whole. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Lynda.
Thanks.
Again, I'm Maddie Lundquist, and thanks for listening to this APQC podcast. To learn more about our research, please visit apqc.org, and we hope you'll have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Lynda.
This was a lot of fun.
It was. Hopefully we do it again soon.
Yes, I think we have lots to talk about with change in the future. Absolutely.
Change in KM and PPM and more.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Everybody have a great day. We'll talk soon.